The rain came down in slanted sheets over Liverpool-esque Gladstone Dock on the night of March 12, 1943, drumming against the corrugated iron roofs of the Royal Navy, Auxiliary Repair Yard, like 1,000 impatient fingers. Beneath the hiss of steam escaping from a ruptured pipe and the low groan of winches straining under the weight of twisted steel, a lone figure hunched over the open engine bay of a Bedford QL truck, his oil-streaked hands working by the dim glow of a hooded hurricane lamp. His name was Arthur Titch Mallory, 26 years old, 5'4", and officially listed on the payroll as Vehicle Maintenance Assistant Grade 2. He wasn't an engineer. He hadn't attended university. He'd never fired a torpedo or plotted a convoy route. But in the next 72 hours, he would do something no admiral, no naval architect, and no Whitehall committee had managed. He would find a way to halve the time it took to repair a U-boat-damaged merchant ship, and in doing so alter the arithmetic of survival in the Battle of the Atlantic. The air reeked of wet wool, diesel fumes, and the faint metallic tang of blood long since scrubbed from the deck plates. Around him, the yard pulsed with exhausted urgency. Cranes swung skeletal loads of boilerplate and fractured propeller shafts through the mist. Welders sparked like dying stars against the black hulls of Liberty ships that had limped in from the western approaches with gaping wounds below the waterline. Every hour a ship spent in dry dock was an hour it wasn't carrying grain, fuel, or ammunition across the ocean. And every hour it wasn't to sailing was another hour Dönitz S. Wolfpacks had to feast on the convoys left undefended. The Admiralty's own projections, whispered in hushed tones over ciphered telexes, warned that if repair turnaround didn't improve by April, Britain would run out of shipping capacity by June. Starvation, not surrender, would end the war. Titch tightened a bolt with a wrench worn smooth by years of use, his knuckles raw from frostbite he'd suffered the previous winter during the Murmansk run. He'd been a civilian lorry driver before the war, hauling coal from the Durham pits to the furnaces of Sheffield. When conscription came, they'd shoved him into khaki and sent him to drive supply trucks for the Royal Army Service Corps. But after a near miss with a Ju-88 over the Bristol Channel in 41, his convoy scattered, his cab riddled with 20mm shells, he'd volunteered for dockyard duty, figuring that at least here, the enemy couldn't see him. He was wrong. The enemy saw everything, and what they saw, they sank. It was during one of those endless nights, standing watch over a half-dismantled stern frame of the SS Empire Dawn, torpedoed off Cape Farewell, that Titch first noticed the anomaly. Not with his eyes, but with his ears. While the engineers argued over stress fractures in the keel and the metallurgists debated weld brittleness in sub-zero temperatures, Titch heard something else, the rhythm of repair itself, or rather, the lack of it. Men moved in bursts, then stalled. Cranes idled, teams waited, tools vanished into the labyrinth of temporary sheds, only to reappear hours later, misplaced or misassigned. The real bottleneck wasn't materials or manpower, it was sequence. Everything was being done in the wrong order. He mentioned it once, over weak tea in the mess hut, to Petty Officer Henshaw, a grizzled dockmaster with a walrus mustache and a permanent scowl. If we pulled the rudder stock before cutting the hull plating, Titch ventured, we could drop the whole assembly in one go, save 6 hours easy. Henshaw snorted into his mug. Listen, son, you drive trucks, leave ship surgery to the surgeons. But Titch kept watching. He began sketching crude diagrams on the backs of ration wrappers, flowcharts of repair stages, color-coded with pencil stubs. He timed how long it took to offload a damaged condenser versus how long it took to fabricate a replacement bracket. He noted that the same team that removed a shattered propeller shaft was later called back to reinstall it, wasting precious hours shuttling between tasks. The system wasn't broken, it was ossified. Every repair followed the same sequence laid down in 1938 unchanged, despite 3 years of war, despite new damage patterns. despite the fact that U-boats now struck with surgical precision just aft of the engine room, where the hull was thinnest and the machinery most densely packed. By late February, Titch had a theory. If you inverted the repair workflow, starting not with the hull but with the internal machinery, you could avoid the cascading delays that turned a 3-day job into a 10-day nightmare. Remove the engines first, extract the shafts, then cut the hull. It sounded backward, even sacrilegious. Naval tradition held that you sealed the wound before you treated the innards. But Titch had seen too many ships sit for days while welders patched holes that would later be torn open again to retrieve a seized bearing. He tried again with Lieutenant Commander Price, the yard's senior marine engineer, a man whose spectacles perched perpetually on the tip of his nose like a nervous bird. "Sir," Titch said, holding out his latest diagram, "if we pre-stage all replacement parts on mobile dollies, grouped by system, not by department, and run parallel workstreams." Price barely glanced at the paper. "Mallory, I appreciate your enthusiasm. But ship repair isn't truck maintenance. There are protocols, safety margins, chain of command." He tapped the insignia on his sleeve. "This isn't about speed, it's about correctness." Titch walked away, the diagram crumpling in his fist. But that night, as he lay on his cot in the barracks, listening to the distant wail of air raid sirens over Bootle, he made a decision. If they wouldn't listen, he'd show them. The opportunity came 3 days later. The SS Fort Lamy, a Canadian freighter hit by U-406 200 miles west of Ireland, limped into Gladstone Dock with a ruptured stern tube and a flooded aft hold. Her captain, pale and shaking from shock and exposure, reported that the rudder was jammed at 15 degrees starboard, and the starboard propeller shaft was bent like a question mark. Standard procedure called for 48 hours of assessment before any cutting began. But Titch knew the Fort Lamy's design. She was a near twin of the Empire Dawn. He'd memorized her schematics from the salvage reports. At 0300 hours, while the night watch dozed by the boiler shed, Titch slipped into the yard with a borrowed oxyacetylene torch and a set of hydraulic jacks liberated from a disabled recovery vehicle. He wasn't alone. 2 other Grade 2 assistants, Bertie Croft, a former garage mechanic from Leeds, and Danny O'Shea, an Irishman who'd once rebuilt a Ford V8 in a Belfast alley, followed him, drawn by the quiet intensity of his conviction. They worked in silence, guided only by the moon's pale reflection on wet steel and the occasional hiss of the torch. Titch directed them like a conductor. First, unbolt the coupling flanges on the starboard shaft, then jack the entire assembly upward, using the ship's own frame as a fulcrum. Only then did he cut the hull plating, not along the traditional seam lines, but in a single elliptical section that matched the curvature of the removed machinery. By dawn, they'd extracted the entire aft propulsion unit in one piece. The hole in the hull was clean, precise, and ready for a prefabricated patch. When the day shift arrived, they found Titch asleep against a stack of timber braces, his hands blistered, his face smudged with soot. The yard foreman roared. Price arrived within the hour, apoplectic. "This is insubordination. You could have compromised the structural integrity. You've violated every standing order." But then Captain McAllister of the Fort Lamy walked down the gangplank, wrapped in a blanket, and stared at the work. That's exactly how I'd have done it," he murmured, "if I'd known it was possible." Price fell silent. The patch was welded by noon, new shafts installed by dusk. The Fort Lamy was watertight and seaworthy in 38 hours, less than half the projected time. No one mentioned discipline, no one filed a report. But that night, in the Admiralty's submarine tracking room beneath the Admiralty Citadel in London, a new notation appeared in the convoy logistics ledger. Gladstone Yard, experimental rapid repair protocol, under observation. Titch didn't know it yet, but he'd just handed the Allies their first real advantage in the tonnage war. And Dönitz, 300 miles away in his concrete bunker at Lorient, was about to notice that his kills were slipping through his fingers like sand. The wind howled through the ventilation shafts of U-Boat Command's Karaman bunker on the Brittany coast, carrying with it the salt sting of the Atlantic and the distant throb of Allied bombers circling beyond Flak range. Inside Bunker 2, Captain Lieutenant Erich Schreiber stood before a wall-sized map of the North Atlantic, his fingers tracing the ghostly paths of convoys that should have been easy prey. A C-126, 18 merchantmen, 6 escorts, had been intercepted on March 17, 1943, just west of the Azores. His Wolfpack Seawolf had sunk 3 ships in the first night, but by dawn, the remaining 15 had vanished into a fog bank so thick it swallowed sonar pings whole. Worse, 2 of the damaged vessels, both hit amidships, had been back in Liverpool within 4 days, patched and repainted, their holds refilled with American tanks and Canadian wheat. That shouldn't have been possible, not with the damage reports Schreiber had seen. Back in Berlin, Admiral Dönitz paced his office, cigar smoke curling around his temples like doubt made visible. "They're repairing faster," he muttered to his chief of operations. "Faster than our intelligence allows. Faster than physics permits." He slammed a fist on the desk. "Find out how." But in Liverpool, no one was celebrating. The success with the Fort Lamy had been quietly replicated on 2 more ships, the City of Pretoria and the SS James B. Stevens. But each time under the cover of night, each time with Titch and his small crew working in near-total secrecy. Officially, the yard still followed the 1938 repair sequence. Unofficially, a new rhythm was emerging. Dismantle from the inside out, stage parts in mobile modules, eliminate redundant handoffs. Titch called it reverse triage. Treat the machinery first, the hull second. The engineers called it heresy. But the ships kept sailing. Then came the storm. On March 28, 1943, Convoy HX-231, 32 ships bound for Glasgow, was ambushed by 9 U-boats in a coordinated night surface attack. The sky was moonless, the sea running high. Torpedoes struck with brutal efficiency. 5 ships went down immediately. 7 more limped away, their sterns shattered, their engine rooms flooded. Among them was the SS William C. Gorgas, a 7,200-ton Liberty ship carrying 10,000 tons of aviation fuel. She took 2 hits aft, one just below the waterline, the other slicing through the starboard propeller shaft. By the time she reached Gladstone Dock on April 2nd, her aft hold was a tomb of sloshing diesel and twisted metal. This was the test. Price. Now, under direct pressure from the Admiralty, to expedite all repairs without compromising safety, reluctantly authorized Titch to assist in the Gorgas's overhaul. No official sanction, no change in procedure, just assistance. Titch knew what that meant. Do it right, and no one would care how you did it. Do it wrong, and you'd be shipped to Orkney to shovel coal for the rest of the war. He gathered his team at midnight. Bertie brought a custom-built dolly cart loaded with pre-assembled stern tube bearings. Danny had spent the day in the machine shop, fabricating alignment jigs from scrap steel. Titch himself had spent hours studying the Gorgas's blueprints, cross-referencing them with damage photos from the convoy escort's log. He knew exactly where the hull had buckled, where the shaft had twisted, where the rudder stock had sheared. They began not with cutting torches, but with hydraulic spreaders. Inserted through the existing torpedo hole, they gently pried apart the fractured plating, just enough to access the coupling bolts. No new cuts. No wasted steel. Then, using a system of pulleys rigged to the dockside crane, they lifted the entire propulsion assembly, shaft, bearings, rudder post, as a single unit. It came free with a groan that echoed through the silent yard like a dying whale's last breath. By 0600, the old unit lay on the quay, wrapped in tarpaulins. By noon, the new one, pre-aligned, pre-lubricated, pre-tested, was being lowered into place. Welders followed immediately behind, sealing the hull with a patch that had been fabricated the night before. Painters applied anti-fouling compound before the welds had fully cooled. At 1800 hours on April 4th, just 58 hours after docking, the William C. Gorgas passed her sea trials. Her engines purred, her rudder responded crisply, her hull held firm under full pressure. Price stood on the dock, arms crossed, watching her steam out into the Mersey. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything at all. But that evening, a sealed envelope arrived at Titch's bunk. Inside was a single sheet of Admiralty letterhead, stamped Eyes Only Operational Security. It read, "Proceed with full implementation on all vessels entering Gladstone Yard, effective 0500. WWII April 1943. Authority, Director of Naval Construction, London." The technique spread like wildfire, not through memos or training films, but through whispers in engine rooms, chalk diagrams on mess hall tables, and the quiet nod of a foreman who'd seen a ship sail that should have been dead. By mid-April, every major repair yard in the UK, Belfast, Newcastle, Hull, had adopted some version of Titch's method. The average repair time for torpedo-damaged merchantmen dropped from 14.7 days to 6.3. In May, it fell to 5.1. The statistical shift was so abrupt that German naval intelligence initially dismissed it as faulty reporting. "Impossible," Schreiber wrote in his log. "No nation can rebuild ships that fast. They must be hiding losses," but they weren't hiding. They were sailing, and the convoys grew stronger. By June, the Allies were not only replacing losses, they were expanding their fleet. New Liberty ships rolled off American slipways at a rate of 3 per day. Damaged ones returned to service faster than U-boats could find them. The tonnage gap, once a yawning chasm threatening to swallow Britain whole, began to close. Dönitz, desperate, ordered his boats to attack closer to shore, to strike in the western approaches where air cover was thin. But even there, the math had changed. Escorts now carried Huff-Duff direction finders, radar, and depth charges with magnetic pistols. And the ships they protected, they healed faster than they bled. Titch never saw any of this from the bridge of a warship or the map room of Whitehall. He saw it in the eyes of the merchant sailors who came through the yard, men who used to arrive hollow-cheeked and trembling, expecting to wait weeks for repairs, now walking off the gangplank with cigarettes in hand and plans to visit their families over the weekend. He saw it in the dwindling stacks of condemned hull plates piling up in the scrapyard. He saw it in the way Price now nodded at him in the corridor, not with approval, but with something quieter, something closer to respect. But the war wasn't over, and the technique had one final trial ahead, one that would take it beyond repair yards and into the very heart of combat. The sea off Newfoundland in late May 1943 was a churning beast of slate-grey swells and freezing spray, the kind of water that could kill a man in minutes if he fell overboard. On the bridge of HMCS St. Croix, a Canadian River-class destroyer assigned to Escort Group C2, Lieutenant James McLeod squinted through binoculars at the horizon, his breath frosting in the pre-dawn gloom. Below decks, in the ship's cramped radio room, a young telegraph operator named Thomas Ellis, 23, thin as a rail, with ink-stained fingers and nerves, frayed from 3 sleepless nights, monitored the low-frequency band for the telltale crackle of U-boat transmissions. Convoy ONS-5, 43 ships strong, was entering what the sailors grimly called the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap beyond the range of Allied air cover, where U-boats hunted in packs beneath the endless sky. What neither McLeod nor Ellis knew was that this convoy carried something unprecedented, not just tanks and flour and ammunition, but hope. Every merchantman in ONS-5 had been repaired using Titch Mallory's reverse triage method. Their hulls were patched with precision, their machinery realigned to tolerances once thought impossible under wartime conditions. They were faster, quieter, more resilient than any previous convoy, and they were heading straight into the teeth of Dönitz's last great offensive. For 2 weeks, the Wolfpack Fink had shadowed ONS-5, waiting for the moment to strike. On May 4th, under a moonless sky, they attacked. U-266 fired first, hitting the SS Harper Lee amidships. But instead of sinking, the Harperley, her internal bulkheads reinforced during her last repair, stayed afloat, her engines still turning. U-638 launched a spread at the West Madaket, only to watch in disbelief as the ship executed a sharp turn, avoiding the torpedoes with a responsiveness no Liberty ship should possess. The reason? Her rudder assembly had been replaced using Titch's modular system, reducing play in the steering gear by 40%. By dawn, 3 U-boats had been depth-charged into silence by the escorts. 2 merchantmen were damaged, but both remained in formation, their crews patching leaks with practiced efficiency. The anomaly was spreading. The Germans were used to ships that broke and sank. These ships broke and kept sailing. Back in Liverpool, Titch heard none of this. He was elbow-deep in the transmission of a Dodge WC-51, troubleshooting a clutch that had failed during a high-speed run to the aircraft factory at Speke. But his method was now embedded in the DNA of the Allied supply chain. The Admiralty had quietly renamed it Modular Stern Extraction Protocol, Type M, scrubbing Titch's name from all official documents. Innovation, they believed, should be institutional, not individual. A system, not a story. Yet stories have a way of surviving. On May 6th, U-264, commanded by the veteran Hartwig, surfaced at dusk to recharge batteries, confident the convoy was scattered. Instead, he found it intact, steaming in tight formation, its damaged ships indistinguishable from the healthy ones. "It's as if they heal at sea," he radioed to Lorient, who, Donitz, furious, ordered a renewed attack at first light, but the Allies were listening. Huff-Duff stations in Iceland triangulated U-264's transmission. Within hours, a Catalina flying boat spotted the sub and dropped sonobuoys. By noon, St. Croix and 2 other destroyers were closing in. Hartwig dove, but the sea was rough, and his boat's hydrophones were fouled by debris from a near-miss 2 days prior. He never heard the destroyers until the first depth charge exploded 50 meters off his starboard bow. The battle raged for 6 hours. U-264 survived barely, limping back to France with a cracked pressure hull and half her crew suffering from shock. But the message was clear. The initiative had shifted. The hunters were now the hunted. In London, the Admiralty compiled the after-action reports. Of the 7 ships damaged in ONS 5, all 7 returned to port under their own power. Average repair time upon arrival, 4.8 days. 0 ships lost to secondary flooding or mechanical failure post-repair. The statistical margin was so stark that even skeptics in the War Cabinet fell silent. Prime Minister Churchill, reviewing the figures over brandy in his underground bunker, reportedly said, "We are not just winning the Battle of the Atlantic. We are winning it faster." But Titch Mallory knew none of this. He finished the Dodge's clutch job, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked to the canteen for a cup of tea. On the radio, a BBC announcer spoke of growing confidence in convoy safety, but offered no details. Titch sat by the window, watching rain slide down the glass, and thought about the Fort Lamy, the Gorgas, the quiet hum of a well-aligned shaft turning in clean seawater. He didn't need medals. He didn't need recognition. He'd seen the ship sail. That was enough. Or so he thought, because across the Atlantic in a concrete bunker in Groton, Connecticut, a group of U.S. Navy engineers had just received a classified dispatch from London. Attached was a single schematic, hand-drawn, smudged, labeled only Mallory Sequence for evaluation. And in the margins, in neat block letters, a note: "This is how they're doing it. Replicate, scale, deploy." The technique was about to cross the ocean. And with it, the final act of the Atlantic War would begin. The air in the Electric Boat Company's design annex in Groton, Connecticut, hung thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp tang of drafting ink on the morning of June 12th, 1943. Rain tapped against the high factory windows, blurring the view of the Thames River, where newly launched Gato-class submarines slid silently into the water like black ghosts. At a long oak table, strewn with blueprints, coffee-stained memos and slide rules, Commander Eleanor Voss, naval constructor, U.S. Navy Reserve, and the only woman in the room, leaned forward, her finger tracing a crude but precise hand-drawn diagram labeled Mallory Sequence for Evaluation. The paper had arrived 3 days earlier via diplomatic pouch from the Admiralty, stamped with triple black ink and the words, "Eyes Only, Atlantic Logistics Priority Alpha." She'd read it twice before speaking. "This isn't engineering," she said at last, her voice low but cutting through the room like a rivet gun. "It's choreography." Around her, senior engineers shifted in their chairs. They'd spent years optimizing hull integrity, streamlining torpedo tube alignment, reducing cavitation noise. But no one had ever thought to optimize time, not as a variable in a formula, but as a living, breathing enemy to be outmaneuvered. Yet here it was, a method devised not by a naval architect, but by a truck driver from County Durham, who treated a shattered Liberty ship not as a corpse to be embalmed, but as a machine to be reassembled. Voss didn't hesitate. She authorized immediate field trials at the Boston Navy Yard, not on paper, not in simulation, on steel, on salt water, on real ships with real holes in their sides. Within a week, the SS John Witherspoon, torpedoed off Cape Cod by U-172 and towed into dry dock with a mangled stern frame, became the first American vessel to undergo the Mallory sequence. The yard foreman, a grizzled Bostonian named O'Malley, who'd repaired ships since the Spanish-American War, scoffed at first. "We don't do things backward here," he grumbled, arms crossed over a grease-stained coverall. But Voss stood on the dock in her service uniform, rain soaking her shoulders, and said simply, "Then start learning." They began at 0200, no fanfare. No observers from Washington. Just welders, riggers, and a handful of enlisted mechanics who'd been briefed only hours before. Following Titch's inverted workflow, machinery first, hull second, they removed the entire propulsion train in under 8 hours. By dawn, a prefabricated stern module, built off-site in a converted warehouse, was being lowered into place. The Witherspoon sailed for Halifax on June 20th, 8 days after docking. Standard Navy estimate, 21 days. The report landed on Admiral King's desk on June 22nd. He read it in silence, then summoned Voss to his office. "Who is this Mallory?" he asked, tapping the paper. "A Grade 2 vehicle maintenance assistant, sir. Civilian status. No formal training," King grunted. "Promote him. Give him a medal. Or don't. Just make sure every shipyard from San Diego to Norfolk knows his name by next month." The order went out that afternoon. Implement Mallory Protocol on all merchant and auxiliary vessels sustaining aft-end damage. Prioritize modular prefabrication. Mandate cross-departmental staging. Report weekly metrics to Cummins. Within weeks. The technique was standardized, codified, and renamed Rapid Stern Reintegration Procedure, RSRP. The British quietly dropped Type M. The Americans never mentioned Titch's name in official correspondence. But in the shipyards, in the midnight shifts, in the grease-smeared notebooks of apprentice mechanics, he was simply the driver. And his method became gospel. Back in Liverpool, Titch remained oblivious. He'd been reassigned to mobile repair units, teams that followed convoys to forward anchorages in Iceland and Northern Ireland, patching ships within hours of damage so they could rejoin the flow. It was brutal work, freezing winds, limited light, constant threat of air raids. But it was also where the technique proved its true worth. On July 3rd, the SS Fort McMurray took a glancing torpedo off Reykjanes Ridge. Her rudder was bent, her starboard shaft seized. Under normal circumstances, she'd have been towed back to Britain, a 10-day detour that would have cost the convoy 2 escort vessels and left her cargo of aluminum ingots stranded for weeks. Instead, Titch's team arrived by landing craft at 0400. By 1400, they'd swapped out the entire stern assembly using a preloaded module carried on a modified Bedford truck. By 1800, the Fort McMurray was back in formation, steaming at 11 knots. The convoy commodore, watching from the bridge of the lead ship, radioed a single word to Admiralty: confirmed. That word echoed across the Atlantic. In Washington, production quotas were revised upward. In Halifax, new dry docks were fast-tracked. In Murmansk, Soviet liaison officers began requesting the British method for their own Arctic convoys. The ripple was no longer a wave. It was a tide. But Dönitz refused to believe it. In his Lorient command bunker, surrounded by maps marked with red X's that no longer matched reality, he demanded answers. "They are not repairing ships," he told his staff on July 10th. "They are building new ones and lying about losses." He ordered photo reconnaissance flights over Liverpool, Belfast, and Glasgow. The resulting images showed something worse than deception: efficiency. Ships moved through yards like clockwork. Cranes never idled. Hulls were patched with geometric precision. There were no mountains of scrap, no queues of derelict hulks. The yards were flowing. On July 19th, he issued a secret directive. All U-boat commanders are to prioritize destruction of repair infrastructure. Target dry docks, crane bases, and prefabrication sheds. Sink the healers, not just the wounded. The first strike came on August 2nd. A lone Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, flying at extreme altitude to avoid radar, dropped 4 500-kilo bombs on Gladstone Dock. One struck the mobile module warehouse. Another cratered the main slipway. But Titch's team had already dispersed their inventory. Modules hidden in railway sidings, spare shafts buried under tarpaulins in nearby fields, alignment jigs stored in decommissioned tram cars. The raid killed 3 workers and destroyed a crane, but not a single repair module. The next convoy sailed on schedule. Dönitz grew desperate. He pulled boats from the mid-Atlantic and sent them to patrol the Irish Sea, hunting for repair tenders and floating dry docks. But the Allies had anticipated this. Escort carriers now accompanied even regional convoys. Coastal Command flew round-the-clock patrols. And the ships themselves, faster, quieter, more maneuverable thanks to precision-repaired propulsion systems, were harder to hit, harder to sink, and nearly impossible to keep down. By September, the tonnage war was over, not with a treaty or a surrender, but with arithmetic. In the first 6 months of 1943, Allied shipbuilding outpaced losses by 1.3 million tons. In the second half, the margin ballooned to 3.7 million. U-boat sinkings, meanwhile, climbed to catastrophic levels. 41 boats lost in May, alone 37 in June. Morale in the U-boat arm collapsed. Crews spoke of ghost convoys that healed as they sailed, of torpedoes that struck true but failed to kill. One young officer wrote in his diary, "We are fighting a fleet that does not bleed." In London, the Admiralty quietly closed the Submarine Loss Assessment Committee. There was no longer a crisis to manage, only a victory to consolidate. And through it all, Titch Mallory kept working. He never received a promotion, never got a medal, never even saw his name in print. When a BBC reporter came to Gladstone Dock in October asking about the man behind the new repair method, Price waved him off. "Team effort," he said. "No individuals." Titch didn't mind. He'd seen what mattered, ships that should have died sailing again, men who should have drowned walking home. That was the only legacy he wanted, but history, though slow, is rarely forgetful. In November 1943, a delegation from the U.S. Maritime Commission arrived in Liverpool. They toured the yards, interviewed foremen, reviewed logs. They asked about efficiency gains, labor coordination, modular design. And then, quietly, they asked for Arthur Mallory. Titch was found under a lorry, replacing a fuel pump. He wiped his hands, stood, and faced the Americans. 2 men in crisp suits, a woman in a navy blue coat with a gold pin shaped like an anchor. "Mr. Mallory," the woman said, "Commander Voss, though he didn't know her name yet, we'd like to offer you a position. Head of Field Implementation, Atlantic Repair Initiative. Salary, rank equivalent to Lieutenant Commander. Office in Washington or London. Your choice." Titch looked past them at the Mersey, grey and endless, dotted with ships coming and going like heartbeats. "I'm not an office man," he said. "We know," Voss replied. "That's why we're asking." He hesitated, then shook his head. "My place is here." "With the ships?" She nodded as if she'd expected nothing else. "Then we'll bring the office to you." 2 weeks later, a new unit was established at Gladstone Dock, the Allied Rapid Repair Coordination Cell. Titch was listed as Technical Advisor, ungraded. He still wore his grease-stained coveralls, still drove his battered Bedford. But now, when a ship came in damaged, his word was law. Engineers deferred to him. Admirals consulted him. Even Price, on rare occasions, would say, "What would the driver do?" And the convoys kept sailing. By D-Day, the Atlantic was secure, not because of a single battle, not because of a code broken or a bomb dropped, but because a man who drove trucks had looked at a broken ship and seen not ruin, but sequence. Not chaos, but order waiting to be rearranged. The war would rage on for another year, but the lifeline held. And it held because someone had dared to do the impossible, fix it faster. The last convoy of the Battle of the Atlantic, HX 358, sailed from New York on May 7, 1945, under skies so clear they seemed to mock the years of storm and shadow that had come before. 38 merchant ships, their hulls painted in fresh wartime grey, their holds packed with food, medicine, and reconstruction steel, steamed in tight formation through the calm waters of the North Atlantic. There were no U-boats to meet them. Dönitz had surrendered 2 days earlier. The wolf packs were silent. The sea, for the first time in 6 years, belonged to the living, aboard the SS Fort Churchill, standing on the aft deck with a mug of lukewarm tea in his hands. Arthur Titch Mallory watched the wake curl behind the ship like a ribbon unspooling across the ocean. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had no official role on this voyage, no rank, no assignment, no orders. But when the convoy commodore learned that the man who'd reshaped the rhythm of repair was in New York visiting the Brooklyn Navy Yard, he'd sent a personal request. "Come home with us." Titch had agreed. Not for ceremony, not for closure, but because he needed to see it with his own eyes. A convoy crossing the Atlantic unafraid. The Fort Churchill herself was a testament to everything he'd quietly built. She'd been torpedoed twice, in 42 off Iceland, and again in 44 near the Faroes. Both times, she'd been repaired using his method. Both times, she'd returned to service in under a week. Now her engines hummed with the steady, clean resonance of perfectly aligned shafts. Her rudder responded to the slightest helm input. Her hull bore only faint scars beneath fresh paint, ghosts of near death, not wounds of defeat. As the ship passed the Grand Banks, Titch walked below decks, past the engine room, where stokers wiped sweat from their brows, past the galley where cooks stirred vats of stew, and into the aft machinery space. He ran a hand along the coupling flange of the starboard propeller shaft, cool, smooth, vibration-free. It was the same design he'd first sketched on a ration wrapper in the winter of 43. Back then, it had been theory. Now it was standard, not just in British yards, but in Halifax, Boston, San Francisco, even Murmansk. The Mallory sequence, though never formally named as such in any Allied manual, had become the invisible architecture of survival. He didn't know that just weeks earlier. A classified post-war analysis by the U.S. Naval War College had concluded that his technique had reduced average repair time by 53% across all theaters, saving an estimated 2.1 million tons of shipping capacity in 1943-44 alone. He didn't know that Admiral King had cited innovations in rapid stern reintegration as a decisive factor in turning the tide of the Atlantic War. He didn't know that in a locked file in Whitehall, there was a recommendation for an OBE, unsigned, unsubmitted, quietly shelved because civilian recognition might complicate inter-service protocols. None of that mattered to him. What mattered was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of dread. No depth charges booming in the distance. No radio crackling with Mayday calls. No officers whispering about how many ships they'd lost this week. Just the steady thrum of diesel engines, the creak of timbers, the sigh of wind through rigging. When the Fort Churchill docked in Liverpool on May 14th, a small crowd had gathered on the quay. Not reporters, not dignitaries, but dock workers, mechanics, and a few merchant sailors who'd sailed on ships Titch had helped save. They didn't cheer. They simply nodded as he walked down the gangplank, as if acknowledging a debt too deep for words. He returned to Gladstone Yard the next day. The war was over, but the work wasn't. Hundreds of ships needed conversion back to civilian use, guns removed, cargo holds reconfigured, wartime patches replaced with permanent plating. Titch slipped back into his routine as if nothing had changed. He still arrived before dawn, still worked with his hands, still sketched improvements on scrap paper. One afternoon in June, as he adjusted the alignment on a crane's hydraulic arm, Petty Officer Henshaw approached, older now, his walrus mustache gone grey, his steps slower. He handed Titch a small wooden box. "Found it in the old admin shed," he said. "Clearing out wartime files. Thought you might want it." Inside was a single item, the original diagram Titch had drawn in February 1943, the one Price had dismissed, the one that started it all. The pencil lines were smudged, the edges frayed, but the logic was still clear. Remove machinery first. Cut hull second. Stage in parallel. Titch closed the box without a word. That night, he walked to the edge of the Mersey and stood for a long time, watching the lights of outbound ships shimmer on the water. He thought of the Fort Lamy, the Gorgas, the Witherspoon. He thought of the men who died before the method existed, and the men who'd lived because it did. He thought of the arrogance of institutions that trust only what they've always done, and the quiet power of those who simply see what's there. He never threw the diagram away, but he never showed it to anyone either. It stayed in his barracks locker, buried beneath spare socks, and a photo of his younger sister in Durham. Until the day he left the yard for good in 1947, he returned to driving, first for a local haulage firm, then for himself, a second-hand Bedford lorry painted forest green, its engine tuned to a whisper. He married late, had no children, lived in a small terraced house with a garden he tended with the same precision he once gave to stern tubes and coupling flanges. Neighbors knew him as quiet, kind, always willing to lend a wrench or fix a neighbor's car. Not knew he'd helped win a war. He died in 1982 at 75 of a heart attack brought on by pneumonia. His obituary in the Liverpool Echo listed him as a retired transport driver and long-time dockyard worker. There was no mention of convoys, U-boats, or repair protocols. His funeral was attended by a dozen people, former colleagues, a few old friends, the vicar from St. Anne's, but in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, in a folder labeled Atlantic Logistics, Unattributed Innovations, there is a single page, a photocopy of a hand-drawn schematic, unsigned, undated, accompanied by a note in faded ink, source, Gladstone Yard, March 1943, proven effective under combat conditions. Adopted fleet-wide by June 1943. Estimated impact, critical, and in the oral histories of merchant mariners. Recorded decades later, voices trembling with age and memory. There are fragments that echo across time. There was this bloke in Liverpool. Didn't say much. But when your ship came in broken, he made it whole again. Faster than you'd think possible. Innovation rarely arrives with fanfare. It doesn't wear a uniform or demand a podium. It shows up in oil-streaked coveralls, in the space between what is and what could be, in the quiet insistence that just because something has always been done one way doesn't mean it's the right way. The Atlantic was won not only by sonar, codebreakers and courage, but by sequence, by timing, by a driver who listened to the rhythm of broken ships and heard, beneath the groan of steel and the hiss of seawater, the possibility of healing. And in that possibility, the lifeline held.